Thank you, everyone. It is an honor to be here. I'm so grateful. I am an evolutionary biologist, and so something of a stranger here, but I feel so welcome, and I appreciate that. I am going to speak to you today about science a little bit, about the nature of the body. What is the body? How can we understand what it is? Not just the human body, but other bodies as well. And then take you on a tour of some of the transformations that our bodies have experienced by keying in on three words. Our bodies are ancient, our bodies are flawed, and our bodies are exquisite. And then at the end of my talk today, I want to talk just a little bit about sex, because that, of course, is one of the key features that is dragging us all into chaos and confusion these days as people make claims, as Bishop Barron said yesterday, that cannot possibly be true. So, while I have come to probably a different conclusion than many in the audience about some of what is true in the universe, I am absolutely certain that a scientific understanding and a religious understanding of the world are almost entirely, if not completely entirely, reconcilable. As such, let us begin. This is Copernicus, one of the great early scientists. Science is a process by which we work to understand our world. We refine it, and we hope to get to an ever closer and better model of what is true, but we won't necessarily get there, and we won't necessarily know when we have gotten there. Science is not a collection of facts, unlike what you may be told by the authorities who speak for science. Science is not the paraphernalia of science, the lab coats and the glassware, the jargon, the advanced degrees, the fancy instrumentation, the grants. Science is a process. And I will be sharing some of the facts that I understand to have resulted from the process that is science today. But science is at its best and its truest when it embraces uncertainty. When we recognize that we don't know, that we are trying to know, but we may not be there, and we may never be there. A scientific approach to the world thus has ample room for wonder and for awe and for serendipity. I am in awe of the natural world. I'm in awe of what we are as human beings, what we have been, and what we can be. I hope that in speaking to you today, you see that I am not taking wonder out with a scientific approach to the world, but actually opening up more opportunity for wonder. I also hope that I inspire questions in all of you, that you actually leave with more questions than you came with. We probably won't have time for questions at the end of my talk here, but I encourage you to approach me later and to ask questions of yourselves, of each other, of me, of anyone, about anything that you have heard here, because that ultimately is the nature of inquiry, which is at the heart of both religion and science. So let's start by talking about what a body is. What does it mean to say that someone has a body? There are roughly, one way to categorize it is to think about it in 5 different components. The first defining feature of a body is division of labor. So what that means is that there are multiple distinct parts which are not interchangeable. To make this clear, let's consider something that is alive, an organism that doesn't have a body. Bacteria, say. Many bacteria form mats. They form mass aggregations of cells. But it's not a body. And one of the ways that you can tell is that if you take some of those bacterial cells away, or even most of them, you're still left with a bacterial mat, and it's smaller in mass, but it's fundamentally unchanged in terms of its nature. It's still a bacterial mat. So bacteria don't have bodies. they don't have division of labor. One of the things that gets divided, so it's easy to say, okay, we have division of labor, we have different parts that do different things, but what is it that gets divided? One of the things you need is structural components, and specifically, these next three I'm going to talk about at the molecular level. These are tiny components of bodies. There are structural molecules in the bodies that we have here on Earth, some of which you will likely be familiar with, things like enamel and collagen, some of which will probably be new to you, proteoglycans and hydroxyapatite. But each of these structural molecules, and there are more, those are four of the primary ones that we have in our bodies, have different properties. Collagen, for instance, is like rope. It has a high tensile strength, and you can twist it and bend it, and it doesn't tend to break. Hydroxyapatite, which is a key component in things like teeth and bones, is like concrete, and it can resist forces in one direction, but not so much in another. So we have these molecules, these structural molecules that have different properties, and when you combine them, when they are combined in different ratios, they form some of the larger elements of the body with which we are familiar, things like bone, as I said, and cartilage. Okay, so you have these parts. You have division of labor, including these parts, these structural molecules, but it's not sufficient to have structural molecules. They must also be connected to one another. And so again, at the molecular level, we have things like molecular rivets and molecular glue. And we have to use metaphor from the human sphere, the world that we can perceive directly. But they really do look like rivets and glue at the molecular level, the things, the parts that connect the structural molecules of the body. Not only do they need to be connected, though, they need to communicate with one another. The communication, again, is at the level of molecules. There's chemical communication between the parts of the body that allow, for instance, bone and muscle to interact and know when growth should take place and where. So we have so far division of labor of structural molecules that must connect to one another and communicate with one another. And finally, we have emergence. Emergence means, and there are so-called weaker and stronger forms of the concept, but emergence means that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So you could, and people have, mapped out the brain, the neural networks of the brain, the circulatory system, understood our glands and our hormones, described fully an arm and a spleen and a kidney, your toes. You could make a list of all the things that we understand about the body, but you won't have a body at the end of it. We're more than that. So there's something emergent in a body, in any body, I'm not just talking about human bodies here, that is more than the sum of its parts. All right, so now that we have a framing for what a body is, how we can understand what the qualities of a body are, let us move into talking about the body as ancient, flawed, and exquisite. To begin with, where I'll spend the most time on ancient, I'm going to walk you through some of the transformations that I see as an evolutionary biologist through time. And we'll begin with a tree. This is a simplified tree of life. There is much that is missing from it, and there are other things that are subsumed in it. So this tree of life, which I'll explain a bit, doesn't say anything about the organisms that are missing. It doesn't say anything about how we got here. It doesn't say anything about how long it took. All it does is describe relationships. And so some of the things that are subsumed in this tree, but which are not named explicitly, are birds. Birds evolved out of reptiles, so birds are reptiles. They can be understood to be on this tree. Similarly, primates, and therefore humans, are on this tree as well, with mammals. So what this tree does say is that mammals and reptiles are each other's closest relatives of those organisms listed here. Most closely related to the mammals and reptiles are the amphibians, and most closely related to that group is what I'm calling the fishy fish, These are the ray-finned fish, like salmon and cod and carp and such. And then we go out and out and out and out. So what we evolutionary biologists understand about the history of life on Earth is that as changes happened, you ended up with groups that became nested in one another. And so here we have the animals. Again, not all the animals are represented here. There are plenty that aren't. But here are some of the animals. Sister, you can see here to the fungus, actually. We're more closely related to fungus than we are to plants. So animals and vertebrates. And I'm going to talk a bit about what it means to be a vertebrate and how the transformation into vertebrates has rendered us even more like us than what came before. And then also tetrapods. Tetra for pods, feet. So tetrapods are those groups of vertebrates, that group of vertebrates that came onto land and turned its fins into limbs. Every species on Earth is a response to the environment in which it finds itself. When I get to talking about the exquisite nature of the body, we will talk some about the responsiveness and the plasticity of the body. But every single one of these sets of organisms here began as a single individual that was in an environment in which it was responding to the trials and tribulations of what was in front of it. So the transitions that I'm going to focus on here are largely hearts, brains, and limbs. Starfish have bodies. They don't look like ours. You remember from the tree before that I put starfish on this tree, not because they're a giant group, not because they're all that important, but because we understand them to be relatively closely related to us. We never looked like starfish, we were never starfish, but they're relatively closely related to us. But their bodies look nothing like ours, despite having bodies. They have the division of labor and the structural molecules that connect and communicate, and they have emergence. But they don't have hearts, and they don't have brains, and they don't have a vertebral column, and one arm can a new starfish make, right? So if you cut an arm off a starfish, if a starfish loses an arm in a way that that arm is still relatively robust, not only can the starfish itself grow a new arm and go on its merry way, the arm can regrow a new starfish. That's not something we can do. Some of the ways that we are different from starfish are represented by sharks. Sharks are relatively basal vertebrates. Again, we were never sharks, we never looked like sharks, but we, like all the vertebrates, have things in common with them that those things that aren't vertebrates, like starfish, like insects, like mushrooms, like plants, don't have. So sharks are a good example of what we call a basal vertebrate because they evolved relatively early and it stuck. That bow plan, that body plan stuck. And so we still have sharks, even though they evolved a long time ago. So one of the things they have that is common to all vertebrates is a developmental plan. Early embryogenesis, early in the developing embryo, our embryos look like that of sharks, and our organs develop from the same embryological tissues. We have three primitive, what are called germ layers, endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm in the developing embryo. And in every vertebrate out there, from sharks to giraffes to humans, the ectoderm forms neural tissue and skin. The endoderm forms the inner structures of the body, like the digestive tract, and the mesoderm in the middle forms things like muscle and bones. That's true, well, it's almost true in sharks. The one way that's not true in sharks is that sharks don't have bone. But everything else that I just said is true of sharks just as much as it's true of humans. So like all vertebrates, and unlike starfish, sharks have a left and a right? They have a cranium and a vertebral column which are protecting our brain, their brains, and their spinal cord. They have paired appendages in the form of these girdles, pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. And on them, what is slung is fins, and those transform into limbs later on. Sharks have teeth, as we all know, but they're entirely made of cartilage. Their bone is entirely cartilaginous. They have no bone. They have very hard structures in their teeth, of course, but no bone. And I share that not because it's particularly relevant to a question of what is the human body and how can we understand it in the modern world, but to point out that there are some things that seem like they would be necessary. To be as ferocious a predator as a shark, surely you would need bone, because we have bone, and bone is what we use to experience most of our strength. And yet sharks do it with none. They only have cartilage. One more thing that sharks, as the example of vertebrates, example of basal vertebrates that I'm using here, reveal is shared fate. So again, starfish don't have hearts or brains. They do those tasks. They have neural processing, they have pumping of blood, but they don't have a centralized place where they do it. The origin of the heart, the origin of the brain happens right around when vertebrates show up. And that centralization of functions in vertebrates is one of the defining features of us, of vertebrates. And that is that our parts have shared fate. Unlike a starfish, our arm can't make a break for it, right? If your arm is severed, it can't go on and make a new you. You can't have your liver decide to make a go of it, your kidneys, or your brain, right? Your brain is inherently embodied, just as you are, just as we all are. We are inherently integral with all of ourselves. There is no being born in the wrong body, and there is no separating some part of our body into something else and having it be human. We can't do it. And part of that could be seen as a limitation of the strength that we get from the centralization that happens at the level of vertebrates, that we have all of the parts of our body have this shared fate. Okay. Remember this simplified tree of life that I showed you before? We've discussed what it means to become a vertebrate from the condition of being an animal. I want us to move forward in time to a less inclusive group now, the tetrapods. Unlike most fish, but like us, Tiktaalik, long extinct, had fins that had begun to act like limbs. That's not actually perfect. We don't have fins that have begun to act like limbs. We have limbs, right? Tiktaalik is one of these transitional forms that is only known from fossils that is understood to be reflective of the life that organisms had as they were beginning to move out of the sea. Again, this is the origin of tetrapods, of 4 legs, and also of terrestriality. So the brains of Tiktaalik were more complex than that of their predecessors, more capable of sensing possibility, obviously, right? They went onto land. Probably many others tried to go onto land and failed. So we only have the evidence of the successful ones. With the move to land, there were so many problems to solve. There were physical problems, chemical problems, biological problems. Life in the water and life on land brings completely different hazards and opportunities. So, for instance, how would the new bodies on land resist the crushing force of gravity? We all do it without thinking about it, of course. It is no concern of ours. But when you move, even we can feel, if you think about it hard, what it's like when you come out of the water, if you're swimming, onto land. The pressures are different. So gravity is a different kind of force on land, and it requires different solutions. How would these bodies move? Having to push against land as opposed to flowing through water. How would they breathe? We don't have gills. Gills wouldn't work for us. And in fact, those organisms that had gills, that came onto land, quickly got dehydrated because the gills, which were taking in water, also shed the water once they were on land. It's not a functional way to be on land. How would they eat? What would they eat? In water, you can orient your entire body to the things that you are trying to eat or where you're going. On land, it takes more work. It takes more calories to do so. So at the origin of tetrapods, we also have the origin of the neck, being able to do this. Sharks don't have necks. Salmon don't have necks. We have necks. We can move to orient in space. And so we also end up with an expansion of our sensory apparatus. As we move onto land, the different refractive indices of air and of water mean that everything has to be retooled, all of our senses. Our eyes have to be retooled. Our sense of smell is different because the chemical signals of olfactory molecules spread differently in air and in water. Everything has to change. These newly terrestrial bodies, first represented by Tiktaalik here, responded to their environment, and it took a very, very long time. Okay, now let's go in and forward in time yet more. This is a mammal. This is a numbat. It's an Australian marsupial, a mammal, but not exactly the kind of mammal that we are. So let's talk about a few of the things that diagnose mammals. All mammals have lactation, right? The eponymous trait for which mammals are named, and we could have made an error. The names of things are not the things themselves, of course, but in the case of mammals, the eponymous trait, the mammary glands, suggests the lactation that is absolutely universal to all mammals. There are no mammals that don't lactate. No, about half mammals don't lactate. There are no female mammals that don't lactate. There are a few mammals that don't gestate, interestingly. At the very base of the mammal tree, you have those weirdos, the echidnas and the duck-billed platypus, and they lay eggs, and they don't even have nipples. They just sort of ooze milk, and they feed their babies that way. But again, not the males, just the females. So mammals have lactation, and we have genetic sex determination. We're not the only ones who have genetic sex determination. What that means is that this is not inherent to what it is to be male or female. We'll get to that at the very end of the talk. But what that means is that in our genomes is described what sex we are. And there are occasional anomalies, disorders of sexual development. But as you all know, in mammals such as us, if you have two X's of that 23rd chromosome, you're female. And if you have an X and a Y, you're male. And that is true across all mammals, again, except for the echidnas and duck-billed platypus. They have like 8 pairs. It's very strange. But put them aside. So we have genetic sex determination, and one of the things that means, one of the implications of that, and we're not the only ones, birds have separately evolved genetic sex determination, there are some frogs and some lizards that have separately evolved genetic sex determination, different specifics in each case, but there is no known case of a species with genetic sex determination that can change its sex. Doesn't happen. Born male, you're male, born female, you're female. Mammals have 4-chambered hearts, and a diaphragm and endothermy. Why do I put all those together? First, let me define them. A 4-chambered heart is a heart that has fully separated oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Our blood goes into our lungs and gets full of oxygen and comes back through our hearts in order to get pressurized and then goes out into our body full of oxygen. We have a muscularized diaphragm separating our gut cavity from our pericardial and pleural cavities up here, and that helps us breathe more efficiently and more strongly. And we have endothermy, which means that we are generating heat from the inside. So all of these traits allow for mammals, including us, to be more active, to be more rapid, and to explore habitats that our predecessors could not explore. if you are an ectotherm, if you're generating, if you don't generate your own heat, if you have to collect heat from the outside, it's going to be really hard to move to Minnesota, right? It's been done, but usually these species that are ectotherms that have moved to Minnesota spend a lot of their winter underground being really still and not doing much, right? As endotherms, I mean, we do have the underground subways and the skyways and such here, right? But we have figured out how to live here, in part through our extended phenotypes, but in part because we're generating heat from the inside. Another true thing about mammals is that we have limbs underneath our bodies. That sounds like a small thing, and of course it's obviously true for us. For humans or bipeds, separately evolved endothermy and limbs underneath the body is birds. And what that gait gives us is, again, an ability to be fast through space. So if you think about what a lizard does as it moves around, it's got this sprawling gait, and as it moves, it has torsion in its torso, and it can't actually breathe and run at the same time. We've solved that problem. And so have these guys. And one more. We have an excellent sense of smell. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about brains here for the next couple of slides. We have mammals evolved these bigger snouts and bigger olfactory lobes in our brains, with which we began to spend more of our sensory effort smelling the world. That gets actually a little bit reversed once we get to primates. But here's another thing about brains. These are also mammals. These are placental mammals like us, as opposed to that numbat from the previous slide, which is a marsupial. And like these, the eutherian mammals, we love to give names that make us seem more special than we are. The bison are the true mammals, eutherian. They have a corpus callosum, which is the band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. So one of the things that we see over evolutionary time is that division of labor that we talked about with regard to bodies, and then a communication of those parts. So just as is fundamental to what it is to have a body, what it is to have the parts of a body, you have a brain that became lateralized into two parts, a left and a right, that are doing distinct jobs, because sometimes it's really useful to be able to do some jobs over here and some jobs over there and not be always getting in each other's way. But then it's also really useful to have those things be connected. And so at the level of placental mammals, the eutherians, we have this big band of fibers that connects us. And here's just a little bit, a few visuals of what brains have looked like over evolutionary time. All of these are line drawings of brains in extant organisms. These organisms all still exist, but they evolved, relatively speaking, earlier to later as you go from left to right here. And you can see, without having to focus on any of the specifics here, that things get more complex. And one of the ways that they get more complex over here is, we don't have a human on here, but of all the brains here, the horse's brain looks the most like ours. It has those two cerebral hemispheres, and they're invaginated. And in those invaginations, so much of our processing happens. And our brains are much more so than that of the horse, but even more so than any of the rest of the organisms laid out here. We have another trend that we see with mammals, and then primates, and then humans, is an expansion of the brain relative to body size. So the brain to body size ratio of mammals is bigger than that which came before it, and of primates is bigger than that of other mammals. And of course, again, we have the biggest brain to body size ratio of all. That doesn't mean that we are our brains any more than we are our kidneys. We are all of it. But we have an increasing ability to think, to see what is, to analyze, to consider the past, to look forward to the future. All right. These are baboons. They're primates. Again, we were never baboons. Just like we were never numbats or bison or sharks or starfish. But we are primates. And so there was some most recent common ancestor of us and baboons that shared some traits. which baboons and we still have. We have opposable thumbs. All the other primates also have opposable big toes. We lost that when we started walking on our hind legs. And we have nails instead of claws, as do all the primates. And we have pads. We have fingerprints and toe prints. We have the terminal bones in our limbs are unfused. What that means is that we can pronate and supinate. We can climb. You don't have that in most other mammals. We became more visual and less olfactory. The primates, the noses of the primates began to shrink, and the parts of the brain that had been dedicated to olfaction became more about scenario building and thinking and analyzing and philosophizing. And our eyes moved frontally, so that now we have binocular vision. And the sense that had been so dominant for mammals, smell, took a second seat, and now we're mostly visual. Primates also began to have longer childhoods and smaller litters, and longer gestation times, later age of first reproduction, all of these things, which of course we see in their most extreme form in humans, that indicate that in the primates there is more focus on learning how to be what it is to be a baboon, in this case, squirrel monkey, whatever it is. You're not born knowing how to be a baboon any more than a baby human is born knowing how to be a baby human. Our incredibly long childhoods, our long gestation time, our tendency to have only one child at a time, all of these things suggest a focus on family, on development, on sociality, on being more than just what our bodies are. Always and inherently embodied, but also more than. Okay, so we are inherently bodied. In some ways, our bodies are the least interesting part of us. They're not as different from everything that came before us as many other things about us are. We're not best, after all, at almost anything physical. Otters can swim better, beavers build better dams, bats fly better, monkeys climb better, right? Cheetahs are faster. We're not best at any of the physical things if you just let us do so with our bodies, but once you start to let us think and build, well, then we've got skin boats and bicycles and hot air balloons and rocket ships. We've got all the things that our incredible brains in concert with other brains, bodies in concert with other bodies have created for us. So we have, as I said, the highest brain to body size ratio of any life known on Earth. We have the longest childhoods and a tendency towards singletons. We tend to have one baby, and we love that baby so dearly. And that baby is born so helpless, unable to do anything for itself. And it takes a very long time, during which mother and child, and usually father and child, and family and child are bonding and learning to be human over the course of years and years and years. We have the longest Achilles tendons of any mammal, of any primate. And that seems to be an adaptation for running. So we explored the Earth by walking first, before we had the skin boats and the bicycles and the hot air balloons and the rockets, right? We were walking and we were also running. And we have eye whites. Seems trivial. There's lots of things about us that I'm not mentioning. Why mention the whites of our eyes? Well, the whites of our eyes are useful to communicate without sound across a distance. Just as tetrapods evolved a neck and they can turn their necks, I can indicate, probably not here in this large dark room, but across some distance, that there's something going on over there without pointing, without saying, without otherwise indicating. So that is something that we have that no one else has, the whites of our eyes. All right. In the little remaining time, let me talk briefly about the flawed nature of our bodies and then the exquisite nature of our bodies. Some flaws are due to historical constraint. That is to say, we can't really get to a better form from here. So the vertebrate eye is the classic example of that. The cell bodies in our eyes are actually in the way of the photons. The photons come in and they have to go through the cell bodies before they hit the receptors. It's not as efficient as it might be, and there is a better eye on this planet, and it belongs to the cephalopods, the squids and the octopus, who have an eye that doesn't have its cell bodies reversed. But we can't get to that eye from here. So we have these eyes that are constrained by history, but they seem to be doing okay for us. Right? Most of our flaws, though, are not flaws at all. Most of our flaws are trade-offs. Here are just a couple of trade-offs. Our air passage, our trachea, and our food passage, our esophagus, briefly share a space, and it makes us susceptible to choking. Unfortunately, probably everyone in here has experienced this. Other primates don't have this problem, though. What else don't other primates do? Other primates don't speak. They don't speak. And what we understand, what an evolutionary analysis of what has happened as our facial structure has changed over time, is that the shortening of our face forced a trade-off in our pharynx, in this area where our trachea and our esophagus are, such that in exchange for being able to communicate with exquisite precision and accuracy and often beauty, we are more susceptible to choking than any of our relatives. It's unfortunate, but it seems to be unavoidable. Here's another trade-off. Childbirth is risky, right? Childbirth is not risky for other primates the way it is for humans. Childbirth is risky for both mother and child. What can you do? Smaller-headed babies would be less risky for mothers to birth, but the smaller the headed babies are more at risk of dying themselves. Already they're born a little too early, right? Already they're born very, very fragile, and we have to be extraordinarily careful with them. So we can't really have babies with smaller heads and still have human babies. Okay, if we can't solve it that way, how about making mothers that have wider hips? Females have wider hips than males. Women have wider hips than men do. Why not make them wider? Well, it turns out there's a stability issue. You make women's hips much wider and we become unstable, we fall down. It's hard to walk. So this isn't a solvable problem. It's unfortunate. It's a trade-off. We can see it as a flaw, but again, the trade-off comes just as the previous one came with the benefit of speech. This one comes with the benefit of having extraordinarily large-brained human babies. All right. The body is also exquisite. It's exquisitely responsive to its environment. Here are a few examples. Again, forelimbs. We have, I think I may have failed to mention earlier, we have this one-to-many plan in both our forelimbs and our legs. One femur, two bones in the lower legs, tibia and fibula, and lots of bones in the feet. One humerus, a radius and ulna, many. This is a feature of tetrapods, one-to-many. And we have a great diversity of forelimbs that have responded to the environment in which they've been in, and they've responded differently. Birds, for instance, fly with their entire forelimbs. All that one-to-many is part of a bird's wing, whereas bats, the Latin name for which is chiroptera, which means hand wing, only fly with their hands. They've got their arms tucked in like this. So there's lots of different ways to get to responding to your environment, and the diversity is extraordinary. We are, of course, exquisitely responsive at the level of individual human cultures. As we moved across the globe, we became fit for different environments. And people whose most recent ancestors were spending time in hot, treeless equatorial regions are more likely to be tall and thin and have darker skin. Tall and thin in order to more aptly shed heat, and darker skin in order to protect from the sun's rays in a place where vitamin D synthesis is abundant and easy. And people whose most recent ancestors were closer to the poles are more likely to be closer in shape to a sphere. shorter and rounder, and with lighter skin. Shorter and rounder in order to maintain heat, to contain heat, the heat that we are generating as endotherms, and also lighter skin in order to more fully pull the sun's rays in, and among other things, synthesize the vitamin D that is absolutely necessary for our health. And we are exquisitely responsive at the genetic level, even. Himalayan mothers with a gene that facilitates 10% greater oxygen storage in their blood have fewer children die during childhood than those without the gene. The estimates of the people who did this research suggest that that is such a selective advantage that if things stay the same, which of course they never do, but if things stay the same, that gene will probably spread to being universal in Himalayan populations within a few thousand years. It is such an advantage for people living at high altitude where it's harder to pull enough oxygen from the air. We are exquisitely plastic. And this is actually another feature of bodies, that we respond to the environment during development. That if you describe the genome of anyone in this room, you have not described a person. You have not described all of the instructions necessary to build a person. What we do during development is we respond to the environment in which we're in and the forces that we are experiencing. So, for instance, these are aortic arches. The aorta is the largest blood vessel in the body. It's over 1 foot long, over 1 inch wide at its widest point, and it comes out of the heart and it feeds that newly oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. It is critical. And yet, look at how many different anatomies there are. And this isn't from different populations. This is within one population. All of us in this room probably have somewhat different aortic anatomies. It works. Fact is, when you're talking about blood vessels, if it gets where it needs to go, it's okay. And so, presumably, during development, there were little changes, little things that were different in each of these bodies, in each of our bodies, such that the blood vessels grew this way or that. Not this way, but that way. We have exquisite plasticity in terms of how our faces look. Our diet in childhood directly affects how our faces look in adulthood, how strong our jaws are, how strong our facial muscles are, what our tooth position is, whether or not they are maloccluded, whether or not we need orthodontia. In short, people eating modern Western diets as children tend to have smaller faces with maloccluded teeth and less strong jaw musculature. And people who, as children, are fed tough things like ribs, or are allowed to chew on sugarcane even, bones, end up with jaws and faces and teeth that are better aligned and that look to us, because we have so much history looking at humans, look to us like healthier faces, and they are. One more example of plasticity. The more time you spend outside when you're young, the less likely you are to need glasses when you're an adult. The more time you spend basically focusing on the far distance, the less likely your eyes are to adjust and decide, you know what, that's not part of my life, therefore I'm not going to be able to see there. So this exquisite plasticity that we have is something that we should all be thinking about as we raise our children, and as we move around. The developmental process continues throughout life. It doesn't end when we hit 18, right? So we continue to be responsive to our environment, although things get harder and harder to change the older we get. All right. Finally, something that is obviously exquisite and ancient. Sexual reproduction is over 1 billion years old. It may be closer to 2 billion years old. In our lineage, uninterrupted for at least 500 million years, probably closer to 1 million or even 2. That is to say that our lineage has been reproducing with 2 and only 2 sexes. Every single one of us had a mother and a father, and each of our parents had a mother and a father going up uninterrupted for hundreds of millions of years. there's a lot of stuff that is very adaptive about being us. But many of the things that vertebrates have evolved, that tetrapods have evolved, have reversed. Legs are really useful, right? But snakes lost them. Snakes decided, obviously not consciously, they didn't need legs. They could do it without legs. They still sexually reproduce. We have limbs, and in some cases, we came onto land, and then the whales went back into the water. They still have sexual reproduction. There are a lot of things that are adaptive that have a lot of fluctuation. Sexual reproduction isn't one of them. In our lineage, there are 2 and only 2 sexes. There always have been, and I would hazard to guess there always will be. One more. A flash of light occurs at conception. We have a scientific answer for what is going on there. Mammalian egg development requires high amounts of zinc, but successful fertilization is hindered by zinc. And so it is the zinc flooding out of the fertilized ovum at conception that produces the zinc spark. It's the one and only moment in our lives that we produce light. Evolution has brought us a tree of life in which the problems are solved with bodies. On that tree of life is us, one species, extraordinary, that comes in the form of the human body. I want to finish just by telling you 4 pillars of the book that I'm writing right now, which can be understood as an invitation to be more fully human, more fully engaged, and to be more fully engaged with science. But again, I think that the inquiry that is inherent in science is also inherent in the religious tradition. The 4 pillars are enlightenment, which is a stand-in for analysis and rational thought. Story, another way that humans make meaning that is different from, but I would say just as important as analysis in how we make meaning of the world. Oscillation, that is to say the movement between modes, and maybe those modes are enlightenment and story, maybe they're rigor and intuition, maybe they are analysis and creativity, but we need to move between modes, and sometimes we need to do so even when we don't think we do. And then the 4th pillar, the 4th foundation in what this project that I've been working on for a while is in fact wonder. The 4th pillar is wonder, as an invitation to, exactly as all of you are doing here, to be in awe and be open to that which you don't know and that which is possible, and embrace the beautiful humanity that we are. So I find these pillars to be intrinsic to the act of doing science, but I think they're intrinsic to the act of just being human. I hope you agree that this evolutionary approach that I have presented to you today will help not erase wonder from the world, but actually provide more. I thank you.